I'm mad as hell, and I'm not going to take this anymore.
That line wasn't fiction, it was a warning, and today, nearly 50 years later, it feels more relevant than ever. I'm Dr. David Grimes, and I'm mad as hell about how vitamin D was treated during COVID, and I think the public deserved a more honest conversation. I say that as a physician, with a master of public health and decades of clinical experience. I've seen what vitamin D can do when deficiency is corrected, especially in vulnerable patients. And during COVID, what I watched was deeply frustrating. Public health messaging centered almost entirely on a single voice, on the idea that one individual represented the science itself. No scientist is the ultimate authority. Science doesn't work that way. It's a process, not a person. Anthony Fauci had real expertise in infectious disease, particularly HIV and AIDS. But that does not make anyone an expert in every area of immunology, nutrition, or metabolism. When it came to vitamin D, early studies that showed no clear benefit were elevated, while others, raising serious questions, were largely ignored. One example often discussed is the difference between standard vitamin D supplementation and calcifediol, the already activated form. Vitamin D taken orally takes time to be converted by the body. That's basic physiology. A small randomized study out of Spain in 2020 explored activated vitamin D in hospitalized patients and reported dramatically different outcomes compared to standard care. That study didn't end the debate, but it should have intensified it. Instead, public discussion narrowed. At the same time, vaccines were prioritized as the primary, often the only, solution discussed, even though they were not immediately available during the earliest and deadliest phase of the pandemic. I believe we missed an opportunity to explore low-cost, widely available adjuncts that might have reduced severity while better data were gathered. Some analysts later modeled what broader vitamin D sufficiency might have meant at the population level, using observational data like the Kaufman study. Those estimates are not proof, but they raise unsettling questions about what could have been studied more aggressively. Even in hospitals, patients arriving with no prior supplementation may have benefited from faster-acting forms, yet that question was never tested at scale. Early in the pandemic, physicians tried repurposed drugs out of desperation. Later trials showed they didn't work, but at least the effort acknowledged that doing nothing was unacceptable. Too many people were told to stay home and wait. And that brings me back to the question that still bothers me. How did major public health institutions fail to openly grapple with data that challenged the dominant narrative? How were entire lines of inquiry dismissed so quickly? We lost millions of people, especially the elderly and those in nursing homes, during a time when humility and open debate were desperately needed. My anger is not about hindsight. It's about accountability. Public trust depends on transparency, and once that's lost, it's very hard to recover. I want to be clear about something before we go any further. My latest book reveals how D3 and K2 could prevent COVID, heart disease, Alzheimer's, and more, isn't about politics. It's about history, biology, and evidence that has been sitting in plain sight for over a century. It explores how vitamins D and K work together in the human body, and how that interaction may influence infectious disease outcomes, cardiovascular health, neurodegenerative disease, and more. Not based on ideology, based on published science. So let me ask you a few questions. What if millions of lives might have been saved with something that costs pennies a day? What if the real failure wasn't malice, but institutional blindness? And what if the story you were told during COVID was missing a huge part of the timeline? Stay with me, because I'm going to walk you through that timeline, slowly, visually, and carefully, and then show you where I believe things went wrong. Long before anyone knew what a vitamin was, physicians were already using one of the most effective tools we had, cod liver oil. As early as the 1700s, it was prescribed for chronic pain, rheumatism, and wasting diseases. In 1789, English physicians were already documenting its medical use. By the early 1800s, it was being recommended specifically for children with rickets. This was happening decades, centuries, before biochemistry existed. In the polluted, sun-starved cities of the Industrial Revolution, children developed soft bones, deformities, and stunted growth. And cod liver oil worked. No molecular diagrams, no randomized trials, just results. Tuberculosis sanatoriums used sunlight and cod liver oil because patients improved. Not because they understood why, but because they paid attention. In the 1920s, science finally caught up. Researchers isolated what they called the anti-rickettic factor. Elmer McCollum named it vitamin D in the following decade. Its chemical structure was mapped, earning a Nobel Prize. Suddenly, what doctors had observed for generations made sense. Vitamin D wasn't just preventing rickets, it was influencing growth, immunity, and systemic health. Before widespread fortification, rickets was an epidemic in Europe and the United States. After fortification, it virtually disappeared. Historically, doses were not tiny. Children were given spoonfuls of cod liver oil daily, often for months or years, with no documented wave of long-term toxicity in the medical literature. But then policy stepped in. In the 1930s and 40s, food fortification expanded rapidly. A handful of manufacturing errors caused rare cases of excessive dosing, and regulators responded by becoming extremely cautious. After World War II, recommended intakes were set just high enough to prevent rickets, and no higher. Immune effects were not the focus. Optimal blood levels were not discussed. Risk avoidance became the priority. That conservative framework remained in place for decades. Fast forward to COVID. Suddenly, vitamin D reappears, not as folklore, but in modern datasets. In 2020, a large observational analysis involving nearly 200,000 patients found a strong association between vitamin D blood levels and COVID positivity rates. Individuals with higher levels tested positive far less often than those who were deficient. Correlation is not causation, but correlations that strong demand attention. Yet during public hearings and press briefings, vitamin D was barely mentioned. The conversation focused almost exclusively on pharmaceutical solutions. And that's the moment where my frustration turns into anger. Because this wasn't ancient history. This wasn't speculation. It was a well-documented nutrient with a century-long track record, and it was treated as if it didn't exist. I believe that was a mistake. And I believe the public deserved a fuller conversation. One of the most controversial questions during COVID was not just what worked, but what was allowed to be talked about. When it comes to vitamin D, the safety record is not new, experimental, or mysterious. In multiple COVID-era clinical settings, researchers used very large, single doses of vitamin D, sometimes the equivalent of hundreds of thousands of international units, without the kinds of acute safety problems the public was warned about. These were short-term interventions, monitored in hospitals, and they did not produce the catastrophic outcomes people were told to fear. That doesn't mean vitamin D is magic. It means the risk narrative was exaggerated far beyond what the evidence supported. Long before COVID, the medical literature already contained decades of data showing that higher vitamin D intakes, when discussed in the context of bone metabolism and calcium regulation, were tolerated far better than most people realize. That's where vitamin K2 enters the conversation. One of the central arguments I make in my book is that vitamin D does not act alone in the body. It influences calcium movement, immune signaling, and gene expression. Vitamin K2 helps regulate where calcium goes. This interaction is not speculative. It's biochemistry, yet public guidelines rarely discuss this synergy, and instead focus almost exclusively on the lowest intake needed to prevent rickets, a disease of extreme deficiency. Those guidelines were shaped by events in the mid-20th century, when rare cases of over-fortification caused regulators to become extremely cautious. That caution never fully relaxed, even as evidence expanded. In my book, I argue that this created a blind spot, where immune and systemic effects of vitamin D were largely ignored in favor of bone-only thinking. I also argue, clearly as an opinion, that non-pharmaceutical immune support was not given the same urgency, funding, or public messaging as patented interventions. You don't have to agree with that conclusion, but it deserves open debate. The book is written for clinicians, researchers, and informed citizens who care about medical history, ethics, and policy failures, not quick fixes or miracle claims. Post-COVID, there is a growing audience asking hard questions. Why were some hypotheses explored aggressively while others were dismissed? Why were inexpensive, non-patentable options rarely studied at scale? That's the space this book occupies. And that brings me to the most uncomfortable part of this conversation. During congressional hearings, the public was repeatedly told to trust authority, to trust that all reasonable options were being evaluated. Yet very basic questions were rarely asked out loud. Questions like, why weren't physicians encouraged to discuss vitamin D status at all? Why weren't existing studies openly debated? Why was the message so absolute? Imagine a senator asking, if vitamin D had any potential role, why didn't doctors tell the public? And the honest answer might be, because guidelines are conservative. Because institutions move slowly. Because non-patentable solutions don't have corporate sponsors. And because public health messaging often prioritizes simplicity over nuance, I believe that combination cost trust, and possibly lives. We also watched frontline healthcare workers, including those with prior infection, face termination over policy decisions that were still evolving. Members of the military faced similar consequences. Regardless of where you stand on those policies, it is fair to ask whether flexibility, transparency, and open scientific discussion were sacrificed. This is not about rewriting history. It's about learning from it. So here's where I want to shift the energy. Don't just get mad, get informed. Talk to your physician about vitamin D testing as part of routine care. Read the studies yourself. Ask why some research questions were never funded. If you want the full historical record and scientific argument I've laid out, my book goes much deeper than this video ever could. And if we want to be better prepared for the next pandemic, we should demand publicly funded trials that examine all reasonable options, especially those that don't benefit powerful industries. Because large clinical trials are expensive, and only governments, not corporations, have incentives to test interventions that can't be patented. If that makes you uncomfortable, it should. Science is not threatened by questions. It's strengthened by them. So let's step back and look at the full picture. For centuries, physicians used cod liver oil and sunlight because patients improved. Long before we had lab tests or randomized trials, the results were visible in real people, especially children living in sun-starved, industrial cities. In the early 20th century, science finally explained why it worked. Vitamin D was identified, studied, and used to eliminate rickets on a massive scale. But over time, fear of rare toxicity cases pushed policy into extreme conservatism. Recommendations narrowed, the conversation shrank, and the broader effects of vitamin D on immunity and systemic health were largely sidelined. When COVID arrived, that blind spot mattered. A century of experience and decades of research were suddenly treated as irrelevant. And instead of asking more questions, institutions closed ranks. That's why this story isn't just about a vitamin. It's about what happens when public health prioritizes authority over curiosity, and certainty over transparency. This is where that moment from network stops being entertainment and starts being a warning. People shouting from their windows weren't irrational. They were reacting to being ignored. So if there's one thing I hope you take from this, it's this. Demand better questions. Demand open debate. Demand that no line of evidence is dismissed simply because it's inconvenient or unprofitable. If you want the full scientific argument, the historical record, and the policy critique laid out in detail, my book goes far deeper than this video ever could. It's available now on Amazon, and it's written for people who want evidence, not slogans. Talk to your physician about vitamin D testing as part of routine care. Read the studies yourself, and if your representatives aren't familiar with the data, send it to them. Reference the large observational analyses. Ask why publicly funded trials were never prioritized. And if this conversation matters to you, subscribe, share it, and keep pushing. Because public health only improves when the public refuses to stay silent. I'm Dr. David Grimes, and I'm still mad as hell, but I'm not giving up. Everything you've just heard can also be delivered in a very different setting. Imagine this not as a YouTube video, but as formal testimony. Addressed to a Senate committee. Entered into the congressional record. Backed by timelines, charts, and citations. In that version, the emotion steps back, and the evidence steps forward. The history of cod liver oil. The discovery of vitamin D. The policy decisions that narrowed its use. And the COVID-era data that should have been debated more openly. That testimony is framed as a policy failure, not an accusation, but a call for reform. Fund independent trials, update outdated assumptions, and ensure that future pandemics are met with curiosity, humility, and transparency. Because if